No, no, he's not dead. The words tore out of the boy's throat before he even realized he was screaming. His palms slammed flat against the glass window of the hospital room, leaving smudged handprints that trembled with the force of his desperation. The cold surface fogged instantly under his ragged breath, obscuring his view for just a moment before clearing again to reveal the scene that was unfolding inside. A scene that felt like watching someone seal a coffin before checking if the person inside could still breathe. Inside, no one turned. The sterile white room glowed with the harsh fluorescent light that hospitals use to make everything visible but somehow less real. Machines stood silent around the bed like witnesses who had already given their testimony. The heart monitor showed a single merciless line, flat, green, unwavering. That sound, the one that should have been beeping, had been replaced by the endless drone of a tone that seemed to vibrate in the boy's bones, in his teeth, in the hollow space behind his ribs where his own heart was hammering so hard he thought it might break through. A senior doctor was already pulling off his gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His movements were smooth, almost rehearsed. Snap, snap, first the right glove, then the left. He dropped them into a waste bin without looking, his eyes already moving toward the clipboard on the counter where he would record what needed to be recorded, sign what needed to be signed, and move on to the next room, the next crisis, the next family whose world was ending. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, heavy, final, sinking into a silence that seemed to expand around them. Someone marked it down. Someone else exhaled. The ritual of death was being performed with the solemn precision of a ceremony that everyone present had witnessed too many times to count. The billionaire's knees buckled. He had been standing by the window on the opposite side of the room, gripping the frame as though it were the only thing tethering him to reality. His reflection in the dark glass showed a man who looked decades older than he had that morning. Hair disheveled, tie loosened and hanging at an awkward angle, designer suit wrinkled and damp with sweat despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. His face was the color of ash, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed, staring without seeing. When his legs gave out, it happened slowly, like a building collapsing floor by floor, starting from the foundation and working its way up until there was nothing left to hold. A nurse rushed to support him as his legs gave out, her hands gentle but firm under his arms. She had been a nurse for 15 years and had caught more falling parents than she could count. Another nurse lowered her head, not in prayer exactly, but in that universal gesture of respect for what had been lost. Someone reached for the sheet to cover the body on the bed. A young body, barely 17, with sandy hair that fell across a pale forehead and hands that would never hold anything again. That was when the boy screamed again. Louder. No. Please. He moved. I saw him move. This time heads turned. Slowly. Reluctantly. As if annoyed by the interruption, by this breach of protocol, by the intrusion of noise and emotion into a moment that required silence and acceptance. Faces rotated toward the window where the boy stood. Doctors, nurses, the billionaire himself. Their expressions ranged from confusion to irritation to pity. But no one moved with urgency. No one ran to check. Because in their experience, in their training, in the accumulated wisdom of their profession, the machines did not lie. The heart monitor did not make mistakes. The flat line was truth, and this boy, this thin, dripping, desperate boy, was simply in denial. The scene widened then, pulling back like a camera lens zooming out to reveal the full scope of what was happening. The contrast between what was inside that sealed room and what was outside in the hallway, where hope still flickered like a candle in a draft. The boy stood alone in the hallway, barefoot on the cold tile floor. His feet were filthy, smudged with the grime of city streets and rain-soaked sidewalks. The tiles beneath him were speckled institutional beige, the kind designed not to show dirt, but his footprints stood out anyway, dark, wet impressions that traced his frantic path up and down this corridor over the past hour. The cold seeped up through his soles, numbing his toes, sending shivers up his calves and into his core. He was thin, too thin. Not the lean thinness of an athlete or the fashionable thinness that came from expensive trainers and carefully calculated diets. This was the thinness of hunger, of meals skipped not by choice but by necessity, of a body consuming itself because there was nothing else to consume. His cheekbones jutted sharp beneath skin that was stretched too tight. His wrists were all bone and sinew, no softness anywhere. Even his neck looked fragile, like a bird's, the tendons visible when he swallowed. His clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else, someone who used to eat regularly. A gray hoodie, 3 sizes too large, with a broken zipper and frayed cuffs that he'd rolled up multiple times, but which still covered his hands. Jeans that were held up by a rope belt, the fabric worn through at the knees and stiff with old rainwater and dirt. No socks, no jacket despite the weather. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves, pooling beneath his feet in small puddles that reflected the fluorescent lights above like tiny, shattered mirrors. Security had already warned him twice that night. You can't stay here. The first time they'd been almost polite about it. Hospital policy. No loitering. If you're not a patient or a visitor, you need to leave. The guard had been middle-aged, tired, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had to give the same speech 10 times a shift. The boy had nodded, mumbled something, shuffled away just far enough to satisfy them, then drifted back as soon as they were out of sight. The second time they'd been less polite, firmer grip on his shoulder, sharper tone. I said you need to leave. Now, don't make me call this in. The threat hung in the air, call it, and meant real trouble, meant potentially being banned from the hospital, arrested even, though for what crime the boy couldn't imagine. The crime of being poor, the crime of being present. But he hadn't been watching out of curiosity. He had been watching because something felt wrong. It had started hours earlier, when the ambulance had screamed into the emergency bay, its red lights painting the walls in frantic pulses. The boy had been taking shelter under the concrete overhang near the service entrance, trying to stay dry, trying to stay invisible. But he'd looked up when he heard the commotion, the shouts, the running footsteps, the organized chaos of medical professionals doing what they do best. They'd pulled someone out on a stretcher. Young, male, unconscious. The boy had caught a glimpse of pale skin, wet hair, expensive clothes. Rich kid, he'd thought. Probably drunk. Probably stupid. But alive, he'd also thought. Definitely alive. He could see the paramedics working, could see the oxygen mask, could see the chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. He'd followed them inside without thinking, slipping through the automatic doors in the wake of the emergency team, becoming part of the scenery. Just another person in the hospital, as long as you didn't look too close. And he'd watched through windows and around corners as they'd worked on the boy, as they'd stabilized him, as they'd moved him from the ER to this room in the ICU. He'd watched the machines beep steadily, reassuringly. He'd watched the doctors nod and confer and make notes. He'd watched the billionaire father arrive, unmistakable in his expensive coat, his polished shoes, his aura of wealth and power, and collapse into a chair beside the bed. And then, sometime after 3 in the morning, when the hospital had settled into that eerie quiet that only happens in the deepest hours of night, the boy had watched the monitors change, had watched the steady rhythm become irregular, had watched the doctors rush back in, had watched the controlled panic of a code being called, had watched them work and work and work until finally, they'd stopped, had watched the moment when professional determination gave way to resignation, had watched them pronounce death. But something felt wrong. The boy couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words that anyone would understand. It was instinct, maybe, or memory, or the accumulated wisdom of someone who had lived on the edge of life and death long enough to recognize the difference between the two. The body on that bed didn't look dead. Not truly. It looked suspended. It looked like it was waiting. And in the half-second before they declared the time of death, the boy could have sworn. He would have sworn on anything that he saw movement. A twitch in the fingers, a flutter of the eyelids, the barest rise of the chest beneath the sheet. Not a reflex, something more. And now the room behind the glass was making the worst mistake of all. The senior doctor turned toward the window, irritation flickering across his face like a shadow passing over water. His expression said everything. Here we go again. Another hysterical family member. Another person who can't accept reality. Another scene that will need to be managed with careful words and practiced empathy that feels genuine even when it isn't. He stepped out of the room and looked directly at the boy, and for a moment, their eyes met through the glass. The doctor's weary and professional, the boy's wild and desperate. The doctor's face shifted then, moving from irritation to confusion. This wasn't a family member. This wasn't even someone who belonged in this part of the hospital. This was a street kid, a homeless kid, someone who had no right to be here, no connection to what was happening, no standing to interfere. Who is this child? A nurse lowered her voice, leaning in so that only the doctor could hear, though her words carried anyway in the peculiar acoustics of the hospital corridor. He's been wandering the hospital. Homeless, I think. The way she said it, homeless, made it sound like a diagnosis, like a condition that explained everything about why he shouldn't be here, why he shouldn't be listened to, why he should be removed as quickly and quietly as possible. The doctor exhaled sharply, the sound escaping through his nose like steam from a pressure valve. He had worked a double shift. His lower back ached from hours of standing. His eyes burned from exhaustion. And now this, a homeless child having some kind of breakdown outside a room where a patient had just died. He needed to handle this delicately, quickly, and then he needed to finish his paperwork and go home. "Young man," he said, forcing patience into his tone the way you might force water through a narrow pipe. It came out, but with effort and resistance. He walked to where the boy stood, close enough now that he could smell the rain and dirt and unwashed skin, close enough to see that the boy was shaking, though whether from cold or emotion or both, he couldn't tell. What you saw was a reflex. It happens. The patient is deceased. The words were gentle but final, delivered in the practiced cadence of someone who had explained death to the living many times before. The tone was meant to soothe, to comfort, to ease the listener into acceptance. But it had the opposite effect. The boy shook his head so hard it hurt, his wet hair flying, drops of water scattering across the glass. Pain shot through his neck from the violence of the motion, but he didn't care, couldn't care, because if he stopped insisting, if he stopped fighting, then the person on that bed would actually die, would cross from this liminal space of maybe still alive into the permanent darkness of definitely gone. "No," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the single syllable, breaking like something fragile dropped from a great height. That wasn't a reflex. He pressed his face closer to the glass, his breath fogging it again, his nose almost touching the surface. His eyes, red and swimming with tears, scanned the room beyond, searching for any sign, any proof, any evidence that he wasn't crazy, that what he'd seen was real. His chest lifted, just a little. "I swear. Please just look again." The desperation in his voice was palpable, almost painful to hear. It was the sound of someone begging for their life or someone else's life, someone who had been begging for things their entire existence and had learned that begging rarely worked but was still the only tool they had. Security moved in immediately, as if they'd been waiting for the signal, as if this moment had been inevitable from the start. 2 guards, both large men in dark uniforms with radios clipped to their shoulders and expressions that suggested they'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. They approached from opposite ends of the hallway, boxing the boy in, cutting off any escape route. One grabbed the boy by the arm, fingers wrapping completely around the thin bicep, squeezing harder than necessary. "That's enough." The boy resisted, pulling against the grip, his bare feet sliding on the wet tile as he tried to stay in front of the window, tried to keep his eyes on the room, tried to maintain his vigil even as he was being physically removed. Panic flooded his voice, raising the pitch, speeding the words until they tumbled over each other in a desperate cascade. "Please, just check again. It's not too late." The shout echoed down the corridor, bouncing off hard surfaces, disturbing the artificial calm of the late-night hospital. Somewhere, someone's machine beeped. Somewhere, a nurse answered a call button. Somewhere, life and death continued their eternal dance. But here, in this moment, everything seemed to pause. The billionaire heard him. Through his own fog of grief, through the cotton wool of shock that seemed to be wrapped around his brain, through the numbness that had been spreading through his limbs since the moment he got the phone call that every parent dreads. "Your son has been in an accident. You need to come to the hospital immediately." Through all of that, these words cut like a blade. It's not too late. For words. Simple words. But they carried the weight of possibility, of alternative futures, of roads not taken. They suggested that there was still a choice to be made, still an action that could change everything, still time, still hope, still a chance that the nightmare could end differently than it seemed destined to end. He looked up, moving his head slowly as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, as if the muscles in his neck had forgotten how to work. His vision was blurry from unshed tears, from exhaustion, from the surreal quality that had infected his entire perception of reality over the past few hours. But he could see the boy in the hallway, could see the security guards dragging him away, could see the desperate reaching, the straining toward the window, the absolute conviction in every line of the boy's thin frame. Their eyes met through the glass, and something dangerous stirred. Hope. It was a tiny spark, barely alive, easily extinguished. The billionaire had spent the last 20 minutes trying to kill that spark, trying to accept what the doctors had told him, trying to prepare himself for a world that no longer contained his son. But the spark refused to die. It flickered there in his chest, small but persistent, fed by the memory of the boy's words, by the raw certainty in that young voice, by the simple fact that someone, anyone, was still fighting when everyone else had surrendered. The hallway grew quiet again as security dragged the boy away from the ICU, their footsteps and his struggles fading into the distance. The doctor shook his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to encompass exhaustion, pity, and dismissal in equal measure. He turned back to the room, back to the paperwork that needed completing, back to the routine of death that required documentation and signatures and proper procedure. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, when everything has been swept clean and broken and left in pieces, and all you can do is stand in the wreckage and try to understand what just happened. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune. The ventilation system whispered through hidden ducts. Somewhere a phone rang and rang and rang before finally going silent. Security pushed the boy toward the exit, past vending machines that glowed with artificial cheer, advertising candy and soda and chips as if anyone in a hospital wanted those things. As if sugar and salt could fill the holes that opened up in a place like this. They passed flickering fluorescent lights, one of them strobing irregularly, making the hallway pulse with stuttering illumination, turning movement into a series of still frames, a flipbook of misery and displacement. They passed people who looked straight through him like he wasn't even there, like he was a ghost, like he occupied some parallel dimension that intersected with theirs but never quite touched. His name was Eli. No one asked. No one cared. If they had asked, he would have told them. Elijah, actually, though no one called him that anymore. His mother had called him that back when he had a mother, back when he had a home with walls and a roof and meals at regular times. Elijah, like the prophet, she used to say, though she'd never been particularly religious. Just liked the sound of it. Liked how it rolled off the tongue with a certain dignity, a certain weight. But that was before everything fell apart. Before the eviction and the illness and the deaths that came one after another like dominoes falling in a line too perfectly arranged. Now he was just Eli or Hey You or Kid or nothing at all. To them, he was just another homeless kid causing trouble in a place meant for real people. Real people. The phrase echoed in his mind as the guards marched him toward the exit. Real people had insurance cards and permanent addresses and clean clothes and shoes that fit. Real people belonged in hospitals as patients or visitors or staff, not as observers, not as witnesses, not as voices crying out in the night with warnings that no one wanted to hear. He had learned this lesson many times in many places. Libraries, restaurants, stores, shelters, everywhere had rules about who belonged and who didn't, and he never belonged, not anymore, not since he'd lost the documentation and the address and the appearance of normalcy that granted access to spaces where society happened. The automatic doors loomed ahead, glass panels that would seal behind him, cutting him off from the warm, dry interior of the hospital and depositing him back into the cold, wet darkness of a city that had no use for him. His heart hammered in his chest, part fear, part frustration, part grief for a boy he didn't know but somehow couldn't abandon. He wanted to scream again, wanted to fight harder, wanted to make them understand that time was slipping away like sand through fingers, and once it was gone, once they waited too long, it would be too late to do anything but regret. Outside, rain hammered the pavement, cold, relentless. The sound of it was like 1,000 tiny drums, a percussion section playing only one note over and over and over until the rhythm became almost hypnotic, almost maddening. Water fell from the sky in sheets, driven by a wind that seemed to come from every direction at once, swirling and gusting, turning the rain into a living thing that searched out every gap, every opening, every possibility for making things wetter and colder and more miserable than they already were. One of the guards shoved him through the sliding doors, using more force than necessary, sending Eli stumbling forward onto the wet concrete. He caught himself with his hands, palms slapping down into a puddle, cold water soaking through to his skin immediately. The impact sent a shock up his arms, but he barely felt it, barely registered it among all the other discomforts and pains and aches that formed the constant background noise of his existence. "Don't come back." The guard's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the tone of someone who has given this warning 100 times and expects it to be ignored but has to say it anyway. It was a formality, a box to check, a line to deliver. Whether Eli actually stayed away or not was irrelevant. As long as the guard could say he'd done his job, had followed protocol, had removed the unwanted element from the premises. The doors sealed behind him with a mechanical hiss and a soft thud, rubber gaskets meeting their frames, creating a barrier between inside and outside, between warm and cold, between hope and despair. The sound was final, absolute, like the closing of a tomb. Eli stood there for a moment, soaked, shaking, staring at his reflection in the glass. The fluorescent lights from inside the hospital lit him from behind, turning his reflection into a dark silhouette against the bright background. A shadow version of himself with no features, no details, just an outline that could have been anyone, could have been no one. Rain ran down the glass in rivulets, distorting the image further, making him look like he was melting, like he was dissolving into the night and the rain and the darkness. Inside that building, just meters away but separated by glass and policy and the invisible walls that society builds between classes, a boy lay on a bed, declared dead. The doctors had pronounced it. The time had been recorded. The machines had confirmed it. Every official source of truth had agreed. Life was over. Death had won. There was nothing more to be done. And Eli knew, deep in his bones, in the same place where instinct lived and memory festered and the accumulated weight of his short, hard life had settled, that the world had just made a terrible mistake. But as he stood there in the rain, water streaming down his face, cold seeping into his bones, a different set of memories began to surface. Memories that explained why he'd recognized that moment in the hospital room. Why he'd known, with absolute certainty, that the boy on the bed wasn't quite dead. Why he wouldn't be silent when everyone else had accepted the pronouncement. The memories took him back to another body of water, another moment of crisis, another time when everyone had been wrong about death.